Thank you for joining us once again. I hope you had a very lovely Easter break. So we are diving right back in and looking forward to another exhibition that is coming up that is still in the works, I imagine.
Very much so.
So tonight, Mark will be joined by George Shaw, who will be and they will be talking about sort of George Shaw's work, as well as the exhibition that will be on the YCBA and the Holburne Museum in Bath later this year and next year. All right, thank you.
Great. Well, hello everyone. Thanks very much for coming back after the 2-week break. And first of all, I just want to say what a treat it is to have George here with us, because George and I have been working together on an exhibition of his work, a retrospective survey of his career and practice that will be taking place, as Nermin said, at Yale, at the Yale Centre for British Art in New Haven this autumn, and then travelling to Bath, to the Holburne Museum, where Chris Stevens, formerly of Tate Britain, head of exhibitions and collections at Tate Britain, is a new director. And this will be one of the first shows that Chris has taken on as the director of the Holburne, and a very important show for the museum there too. And I think, as all of you all know, especially those of you who've done your reading preparatory to today's lecture, George is one of the most exciting and interesting contemporary British artists who, over the last 25 years or so, has really produced a remarkable body of work, and has done so through a succession of exhibitions. And what we thought we'd do, because this, of course, thinking about the theme of the lecture series, is that we would focus on a number of the exhibitions that George has worked towards and for, one-man shows or one-artist shows that he's been involved in. And then we'll spend the last part of the lecture talking about the show that we've been putting together, as I said, over the last few years, since 2015, when we first met each other and first started talking about a show at Yale. So we thought we'd begin, as it were almost before the beginning, because George is really well known, of course, as all of you will yourselves know, for these astonishingly close-eyed images of a particular place, Tyre Hill in the Midlands, and for an imagery that offers a topography of his childhood, but also of a very particular place, and there's changes that have taken place in that environment over the years he's been painting it. It's a remarkably complex body of work. But before he focused on that kind of subject matter and that kind of project, he did rather different kinds of work, which might surprise many of you. And so we thought we'd begin with a show that took place at Sheffield. It was called Recent Work, a hang of George's work at the Graves Art Gallery in Sheffield in 1992, which seems a long time ago, I know. And here's an image, a black and white image that dates it already, of a selection of George's work from that period. So I don't know, I've sort of invited you then, but we begin with this. And your thoughts about, at that stage, the work you were doing and how it related to an exhibition.
Well, I mean, you're an artist. When I was a kid, and the one thing you wanted to do as an artist is to exhibit your work. So anybody who asks you to exhibit your paintings or whatever you're doing at the time is a great privilege, and it still remains that way. So it always seemed to me a complete waste of time, even as a youngster, to kind of do stuff which would never have an end point. For a long period of time, that was the case. Like a lot of artists, it goes nowhere, it just goes down the toilet, or goes under the bed, or goes in the store cupboard, or goes to art college, depending on how you feel about that. So I was at art college. I did film and video art college, which is a different kind of exhibiting kind of thing. Now that presumably happens on the internet. But I gave all that up, thankfully. Started painting again around about 1990. Had moved from London to Sheffield, worked with a group of artists who had a warehouse studio set up in Sheffield, and reinvented myself in my own mind as a painter, which is the kind of painter I wanted to be when I was a child, which was bold, expressive, dirty, drinking, sexy, everything I wanted all the great modernist artists or what I wanted from them. That's what I wanted from myself. Drinking became important at 7 o'clock because the pubs weren't open till then. So painting became important until 7 o'clock. Obviously, artists like Bacon, de Kooning, all the great modernist artists who seem to have a great lifestyle were very important. All the other artists who were working in this studio at the same time had exactly the same philosophy. There was no money. I can remember draining oil from cars to mix in with the paints, abandoned cars or what have you. There was no windows in the studio, so the Sheffield wind blew quite icily in there. No stove, no hot water, nothing. So, but very exciting, and very productive. You were egged on by quite a lot of your peers to actually to make work. And then we got this opportunity. The Graves Art Gallery is quite an historical space in Sheffield. They were very supportive of the local artists who were working at the time in the late 80s and early 90s. And they gave, I think there was about 6 or 7 of us at the time in the studio set up, and they gave us a whole summer in the art gallery, which you carried the paintings. It was about half a mile. You carried all the work. You didn't have a van. You just carried it. You just hopefully it wasn't raining and the wind weren't blowing. The buses wouldn't take it. That's what you did.
And you all had a week each, is that right?
Oh, we had a week each, yeah. And the exhibition was called Revolver. Yeah. So, and
you got a review.
We got a review in The Guardian, which was something like the most hard-working group of artists working in the north of England today, which we were all very proud of. So, which kind of went along with this sort of image, fairly masculine, fairly hard drinking, hard living kind of, which was what I wanted from art college. But when I went to art college, I was a teetotaling vegetarian, so I missed out on it all. And everyone thought I was a homosexual, so I missed out on the women as well. So it kind of carried on, missing out on stuff. I missed out on everything here as well, I think.
So that was 92. There was a show in 92, but no other exhibitions for a while.
No. Basically, you can see why. Well, the work probably was crap. My attitude probably wasn't very politically correct. There was probably lots of things going on. Painting was kind of dead, obviously. It's always dead. It's always dying. But we'll come to that. I think painting its relationship to death is quite important, actually. So
this is 1992, so the first exhibition, or major exhibition for George. And then we thought we'd discuss a while the relationship between the studio space, or the student studio space, and exhibitions at the Royal College of Art. So again, most of you will know this, but George was enrolled at the Royal College in 1996 as a student on the MA in the painting course, a really distinguished cohort of painters that year, which included not only George himself, but artists like Herman Anderson, Gillian Carnegie, and others, Lothar Gotz as well. And it sounds like a really interesting, and from conversations with George, a really interesting group of artists. But we thought we'd begin by talking a bit about the way in which the studio space is itself an exhibition space for artists. And this is a photograph of the studio space, George's studio space at the college.
Well, when you're at a place like Art College, and particularly at the Royal College, your studio space is your exhibition space. The amount of people who came through here on a daily basis, whether they be fellow students, whether they be tutors, whether they be visiting artists, whether they be curators or whatever, there was a constant stream of people in. So
filmmakers, sometimes.
Filmmakers, yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, for me, it was a godsend working for 4 years in the complete abject wilderness of nobody being the slightest bit interested in what you're doing. The worst thing you could possibly do was say, no one come to my studio. I just thought the best thing to do would be come into my studio. In fact, I had a sign outside my studio saying welcome. I mean, one of my great heroes would have been someone like Francis Bacon, someone who constructed his studio as an extension of his work, really, and was very acutely aware of that, almost in a very contemporary way, which we would think of now. We have to also remember that he began his creative life as an interior designer rather than an artist, which I think is very telling when you look at how he constructed his studio. But it was there to be viewed, and I think it's there to be viewed as being representative of the workings of an artist's mind, or if we want to go a little bit more poetic, of their heart or their soul or whatever they're thinking of at the time. So,
but it's quite interesting looking at this slide. is that of course the work that you're working on, including the breakthrough work for which you're really well known already, or this seems to have been a really important work. They're already on display in quite a clear way, so that there's a sense in which you're already, curating sounds too precious a term, but you're already organising and your work in a way that makes it very accessible for a visitor to come and look at and to appreciate.
Well, I think it goes back to school days when you kind of had to show your workings out, and you got more marks for your workings out than you did for the final result. And to be quite honest, the workings out were always more interesting. And you could actually pass by getting the wrong answer if your workings out were right, and which I quite like. It's a great concept. You know, we think of science or maths as being almost like a very objective thing. That seems a very subjective way to look at stuff, and I think there's been no greater subjective place than the studio. And I think what I was doing was just, even from the early days, even that photograph of that de Kooning type studio. It's artfully displayed. I took the photograph myself. Well, who else would take the photo? No one was interested. Nobody else came and went. You're constructing it. Ostensibly, you're constructing it not for this kind of thing, not for visitors, but the first viewer of the exhibition is yourself, is me. So I think if it looks like an artist studio, if it looks like something that's going on here, something must be going on. So in that first step, the only thing that was going on was a kind of Mike Yarwood impersonation of de Kooning and those kind of great modernists. But in this kind of space, what I thought the best thing to do would be, if you're going to impersonate someone, you kind of impersonate yourself. Yeah. So that's how the origin of this work, this is the house. I mean, if you can think of the house here with the green door, just above the green door, that's our house when we were kids. So we lived here from 1970 onwards. So just above the green door is the bathroom, and to the right that's my bedroom, which I converted pretty quickly into a studio and was my first ever exhibition space. And from there on, I had exhibitions in the local school, and you'd have in the sixth form college, in the local council, in the local Herbert Art Gallery in Coventry, who were quite fond of putting on exhibitions of school kids and stuff like that. But of course, underneath it all, what you were thinking was, this is not what I'm fit for. I'm fit for better things than showing at the local art college or the local. So that's.
You're right. But here in the studio space, it was partly the response you got from fellow students and from teachers, wasn't it, tutors on that course, to these works that kind of gave you a confidence about pursuing this project.
Yeah, I mean, if a number of people come in there and tell you it's awful, it's just as useful as them telling you it's great. In fact, telling you it's great is actually quite unhelpful. But there was a movement to be slightly different to the next door neighbour in a sense. So,
but within the college itself.
Within the college, but also this is kind of it's mid-sensation, post-YBA. I mean, when an exhibition happens about a movement, the movement has been over for so many years. Most of the people who have taken part in it are dead or got married. One of those type of things. So when sensation happened, most of those artists are gone, and it was the exhibition was a kind of corpse of a movement. So when we went to go and see it as students, in 1997, 98, Yale Centre. We just thought it was shit, to be honest. We thought it was awful, you know, sculptures of flies and pigs and stuff. He was like, what's this crap? You know, this is what Grandad was making. Even though they were the same age as me, because I was a mature student. And I thought the antidote to it was to do to paint the house you were brought up in. Seemed to be completely and utterly opposite to... It felt like writing a poem, which sounded awful at art college. You know, if you read Philip Larkin... Now Philip Larkin, people who read The Guardian read Philip Larkin. In 1996, people who read The Guardian did not read Philip Larkin. So that was the kind of thing that was... Or John Betjeman, or that kind of over-sentimentalising, syrupy, nostalgia. I thought, yeah, let's have that. Let's have that as complete and utter abjection. And to make that in the studio is one thing. If you're working in a studio in Nottingham or in Sheffield, where I was, and nobody's interested in it, is one thing. To make it in the Royal College is another thing. Then to have somebody come in and say, we will want to put that up on a wall, I thought, come on, where are you? Let's see if you want to put that on a wall. Because I thought no one would want that. I thought, once I've finished at the Royal College, I'm going back to teaching, primary school teaching, which is what I was doing before I came to the Royal College. So the Royal College would be a holiday, a bit like going to Benidorm for 2 weeks.
It's interesting though, because you did this kind of painting, and you were getting a response to this kind of painting, and at the same time you took this opportunity to do this show of drawings at the David Hockney Gallery. God only knows. Drawings by George Shaw, a very different, entirely different character. In fact, I'm afraid I'm not showing you, we're not going to be able to show you the drawings here. We're thinking about whether we might do a display of such drawings here at the Centre to coincide with George's show. But do you want to say a word about this?
Well, they had an exhibition space. It was called Stevens Building, named after one of the old rectors, Jocelyn Stevens. Yeah. And the Royal College of Art it's like a graveyard, because everyone's named after people who have gone. So and it's all their famous, you know, the Dyson this. Now it's the Dyson toilet and the Dyson this and the Dyson stairs and yeah, I don't know how they square that with the Dyson thing, but anyway, that's another conversation. But they have the Hockney Gallery, and you could rent it out. It was free. You just booked it, and I thought, well, just book it. Put some exhibitions on, and I booked it, and then it came, and you think, what am I going to show in it? And I thought, it was the Hockney Gallery. I thought that was quite funny, because I quite like David Hockney's early stuff, and I quite like them 70s pen drawings he did. I quite like the stuff he did in the Hockney by Hockney book. But you couldn't move at the Royal College for people talking about Hockney. Christopher Frayling was Hockney. Everything was Hockney. And so I thought having an exhibition at the Hockney Gallery was quite good. And so I put these drawings, which I was kind of making in the studio, slightly in my spare time. And there were slight fantasies, slight dreams, slight automatic drawings. There was 52 of them. And I just hung them up. I do have installation shots, and I'm sure that some of them are quite amusing and some of them are quite horrible. But it was a kind of reverse Hock. They were done with pen and ink. You know, the opposite to those rapidograph drawings, which I was impressed with. You know, the beautiful pen and ink drawings he did. They were kind of the opposite to that, because I can't really draw that well. I can't draw that kind of like Hockney can, but and I don't have his beautiful subjects, and I don't have W.H. Auden hanging about. But the thing was, you did this exhibition in the middle of it, and you got it for a week.
Yeah, but it shows how entrepreneurial you're already being at that stage. You know, that you thought you took an opportunity, you saw an opportunity, you took it, having an exhibition space, and also doing something which was quite different to the paintings. I think
But,
that's
but
telling.
I didn't think of it as that opportunistic, really. What did you say?
Opportunistic.
Opportunistic,
Yeah, in
yeah.
a good
Because
way.
it was downstairs. My studio was
Entrepreneurial.
upstairs. I just thought that's what you did when you went to art college. Your studio was upstairs with an exhibition space downstairs. Why isn't everybody doing this?
I know. And they weren't, though.
Well, they weren't. No, there was when I said, "Oh, I want to book it for this week." Oh, it's free. Why? Why is it free? It's an exhibition in London, and of course, 3 people came for the opening, and then we went to the pub. There was more people in the pub than at the opening. I thought, hang on, where were you all? So, that's how, if I talk to somebody who would want to put an exhibition, can you introduce me to the gallery system in London? Yeah, have an exhibition first. Maybe that's the first thing you should do. And that's what I thought the best thing to do was.
Then there was the actual degree show too, and you decided to show works that were very different to others of your contemporaries, and also even compared to some of the other work that you were getting already.
Well, degree shows are funny things, because people work up for 2 years or 3 years on their course, and then they start making their degree show. Well, what were you doing for the last few years then? That's what I thought. I thought, I'm not going to make special degree show paintings. What I had in the studio at that particular time was what went on. So I think I had 4 or 5 paintings. They're 40 centimetres high by 50 centimetres high. I didn't want to make the biggest painting or I didn't want a big painting, sensation painting with a dead dog on it or a great big penis or something like that. I just thought 4 or 5 paintings of the wood we used to play in as a kid. They were the most modest. I can't believe I did it. When I think about the paintings I was making 4 or 5 years earlier, it was quite a bold move to.
Bold move into modesty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but, yeah. I mean, all them sort of contradictions I quite enjoy.
But they sold like that, didn't they?
Yeah, but paintings of woods always sell.
That's the tip. Okay, so this was the time. So at the college, there was the degree show, and then soon afterwards, you began your connections with Anthony Wilkinson, who's joining us here tonight, and who's represented you.
But it's funny, because I remember asking Anthony, and he'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought he'd saw my degree show, which he didn't. And then I was in the New Contemporaries the year before, which he didn't know about that.
So what have you seen?
He talked to someone I spoke to in the pub.
There we go.
So there's no point in making work in isolation. So you make your work, you do that sort of thing in your, because what you want is an exhibition, and then you want to kind of sell some paintings or do that. So how do you do that? It's not going to happen on your own. The one thing that's required is, like an exhibition requires the contact between you and another human being, and I think art is something. Big definition of what art is. What is art? It's some way of one human being making some kind of contact with another human being. And one of the great things about art is that contact isn't necessarily directly with that human being in your own time. It could be with a human being in the future. And that's quite science fiction, but it's possible. Science fiction is quite possible in art. And that's what happened.
So this is a painting that...
Well, the thing is, when you go to the pub, what you talk about is your work.
Yeah.
It's an advert. It's like, because no one's going to... The observer isn't coming to your studio. You have to go to the pub. And where do people meet? At the pub. So that's what happened. And then I met someone in the pub, and then Anthony met the same person in the pub. If I believe that's right, Anthony? Yeah.
There's a theme emerging here.
So...
I know exactly what you're all going to have to do after this talk.
They call it networking now. They call it drinking when I was younger.
Well, thanks to that networking in the pub, you began this long association with Anthony and his gallery, or galleries. But there were 2 exhibitions that came out of that happened in the immediate aftermath of the Royal College, your time at the Royal College. I thought we'd quickly look at them in turn. One was of Innocence with Anthony at his gallery in Cambridge Heath Road, I think, in those days. And then another with your fellow student, John Strutton, The Land of Nod. So I'm afraid I've got a very ropey slide of the kind of invitation card to the Innocence exhibition, which I'll show you now. So what are your thoughts and recollections of that show and what it meant?
Well, it looked like all the paintings I should have put in my degree show, in some ways. Some of them were left over from the stuff I did at art college. And then I got a studio after I left art college. Anthony shown some interest in doing an exhibition. Yeah. So that gives you, I don't know, it gives you a kind of incentive. You know, I've always worked, I've always had a job or something. So having a reason to get up in the morning to make something happen is quite important. Yeah.
So that's the thing. I think that's the thing that I've recognised working with George is this sense of the exhibitions punctuating a career, and also being continually the thing that you work towards next, and which offer a distillation of different phases of practice, so that they're almost like chapters of a history or of a book. They're performances, but they're also deadlines and things to aim towards. And it's interesting, look, this is 11th of March 1999, so just 8 months after you left college. And so this was the next thing to work towards having left college.
Yeah, the little funerals, you know. Like, you know, you work towards one death and then you get resurrected and then you move on to the next one.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, that's how I think, you know, talking about painting and its relationship with death, I think that's what we don't look at paintings, really. Painting is a doing word. It's not an object. Painting is like walking. It's got an ing on the end. What we're actually looking at is painted. Looking at the past tense. And I think that's quite an interesting thing about exhibitions and museums, is essentially they're displaying corpses. So it's great looking at other people's corpses. You don't want to look at your own too long. Not without the promise of rebirth. Yeah. So what happens with an exhibition, you work towards it, and you have a great night, you have a wake, then you have a hangover, and then what you've got to do is, and then a lot of people patting you on the back, and maybe it gets that little write-up in the Observer, if you're lucky, you know, a little obituary. Yeah. And then on Monday, it's back to the studio and a cold floor and baked beans for lunch. So it's, and then and I quite like that. It's a really nice interval way of, instead of thinking that, I've got 70 years. You know, I've got 18 months. I've got 6 weeks. I've got 24 months to make these things. And quite often they're paintings which, do you know what, they need a lot more time to work on. But don't we all?
Yeah. So this was the first show with Anthony. And at the same time you were developing or thinking about another project with John Strutton. We've got a few more images of this, and it might not be so or this side of George's work is not so well known, so I think it'd be great to talk through this practice, which is run as a parallel practice to his painting, his practice as a draftsman.
Well, nobody else wants to show it. That's what happens. We only see what artists do when artists either put it on themselves, where they've got the finance and the way that commerce happens. But ostensibly, with galleries, the gallery or a commercial gallery will put on what it thinks it can sell or what it thinks best represents the artist. A lot of artists I know make work which is almost like abject. You know, it has no value outside of the studio. So I'm quite intrigued by that.
Yeah. Well, this show was called The Land of Nod, and it was a show you did in collaboration with John Strutton, who'd been a fellow student at the Royal College, now teaches at the Royal College. This is a view of John in your studio at the college, with an array of the photographs that you use as partially use as a basis for your work, with a collage of other objects that you typically surround yourself with, don't you, as you work. And then it generated this amazing exhibition called The Land of Nod. I'll just show everyone, you can see the time. It's quite interesting to see these cars outside it, and then the lift gallery.
Only in that period would you get a car called is it a laser? Is it a Capri laser? I don't know. I might be wrong in that. But
this is the window of the gallery, and and inside there was this amazing collage, which in some ways amounted to kind of an English pantheon, one which explored the world of George and John's childhoods and their adolescence and all their interests during that period, so it was very retrospective, but it offers also a really astonishing chronicle of English culture's desires and obsessions and nightmares. It's a really fascinating show, and it's quite interesting to think about the relationship between this imagery, there are John and George, standing alongside the display, which, as you can see, is very, very different to a typical gallery display. So if you could say a few words about that.
Well, I mean, it grows out of, I mean, the Lift Gallery was something that was self-financing. I don't see as much of it now as possible, as you probably should do. And they commissioned artists to do kind of one-off exhibitions. There was no money involved. Commissioned sounds like there's money involved, but you just got the space. So, but I think, what else would you do? It's great. It's like it's like a hobby, really, like pigeon fancying or greyhound racing or or model making. All these things are, why would you expect a grant for it? It's what you kind of do in your spare time. And me and John, when you get the privilege where someone says, "Oh, here's a place in a gallery in Shoreditch, you can have it for a month. We'll pay for the heating and the lighting and all the rest of it, and you can do what you want in it." And you kind of go, why wouldn't you have it? It's brilliant.
And what did you do for it?
Well, me and John, exactly the same age. We found ourselves at the Royal College of Art together. We hit so many similarities to do with the films, the music, the TV, family history. He was Irish Catholic, I was Irish Catholic, interested in religious imagery, interested in popular cultural imagery, interested in the history of art, interested in music, and how how we might put all them things together. We'd seen a number of artists who'd been exhibiting in America, particularly West Coast artists, in the Helter Skelter show, Mike Kelly, Paul McCarthy, Jim Shaw, these kind of guys. And we thought it might be interesting to kind of do the same thing with British culture as they'd done with American culture, which instead of it being a celebration, a popular celebration, which is like the 60s pop art was, became almost symptomatic of a mental breakdown.
Amazing combination of images. So you get images of things like early Face magazine covers of some of the pop stars that you were...
Yeah, serial killers.
From, you see the Yorkshire
kind of,
Rippers,
they're pop stars. And it all goes into the same mix. There was at least one drawing of Jimmy Savile in that, so we weren't wrong.
No.
So, I mean, and to be honest, history has proved us right and will continue to prove most people right about the popularity of popular imagery, that it has a relationship with the darkness of our, that we would rather not investigate. We only got to look at fairy tales, the way Walt Disney kind of made them very acceptable, and they're based on Grimm's fairy tales, which weren't acceptable, and they in turn were based on things which even the Grimm brothers didn't find acceptable, things that are based in folk tales, which have no other expression to do with the dark psychology of most human beings. So we found them resonant in things like Doctor Who, Blue Peter,
Kes, you had
all those kind of images, which are almost like quite insidiously humble. So, and there was a performance, and you can see the remnants of the performance in the side, which is a great 12-foot long bed, which we propelled around the space. Something like Morecambe and Wise in bed together, mixed up with Willy Wonka. It was quite, it was, we're planning on doing a return to the Land of Nod.
It'd be nice to see a return to the Land of Nod.
But it was very much based on us. If you looking at it, the aesthetic of it is very much like a studio rather than that pristine sort of exhibition space. Nothing is framed, nothing is glazed. There's no interest in archival processes. There was no invigilator.
No.
So those, and it has a relationship to things that go on in not only studios but in schoolrooms, in parents' evening when they put pictures up on the walls. It has a relationship to the things that teenagers would put on their bedroom walls, or prisoners would put on their prison cell walls. Things that people do out of their daily life, rather than out of their, rather than a kind of exhibited artist sort of status, really.
So two very different kinds of exhibition taking place soon after George had left the college, and then but interestingly, in neither case was there a catalogue produced or published. But that changed in 2001, when, again, in Anthony's gallery, George put together an exhibition called The New Life of his work, but also compiled a really fascinating publication, which is part artist book and part catalogue of the show, called IDST, or at least that's what I call it. I trying to find it, in writing about this book, as I have done for the catalogue, trying to find a proper title for it. It was quite tricky. But you'll see why. And I thought it'd be great to use this as a chance for you to talk a bit about the role of catalogues and exhibitions and their relationship. So I'll quickly show everyone. I mean, maybe you can talk through it. Let me show the images and you talk about this. This is it. This is the cover of IDST. Do you want to say what it is? What it was?
Well, for my generation, your generation, I won't cast any nasturtiums from the present crown. But when you were a child, in secondary school, you were given exercise books, English, physics, whatever, and your first job was to cover it.
Yeah, you see, some people remember that. Others what?
If you were fancy pants, you got sticky back plastic. If you were most of us, you got your mum and dad's wallpaper. Which basically, when the teachers were given these exercise books, just gave them an indication of what their houses looked like. Because my dad had been made redundant in 1980 from British Leyland, he had to spend his redundancy money within like a number of minutes. Otherwise, they took it off his unemployment benefit. So one of the first things they did was buy flock wallpaper, which was the symbol of greatness. It made the house look a little bit like an Indian restaurant, and it also gave us somewhere to stick a fuzzy felt, if anyone remembers fuzzy felt. So this was what was left of the wallpaper once the flock had been deflocked, and it went on the cover of my physics book. And at some point in my 13 or 14-year-old head, I'd written on it who I fancied.
Yes.
IDST stands for If Destroyed, Still True. So if you wrote George loves Debbie, and you wrote that underneath it, she couldn't get rid of it. It's slightly like a small curse or a little ritual that kind of went on. The variations of it. When I first did the book, I thought everyone would know about it. Very few people knew about it. I'm not sure whether that was because most of the people in the art world hadn't been to the school that I'd been to. I suspect it was, because subsequently I went on a spree since then, photographing graffiti which has that written underneath it. And I've sent you, that's probably 80 or 90 examples of it in the last 15 years, and it still goes on.
This is what you open the book, this is I think the second double-page spread that you see.
And this is Cathy Hargreaves from Grange Hill. Grange Hill started in 1978 when I started secondary school. It started the month before I went to secondary school and made me fear secondary school with absolute horror. But the thought of meeting Cathy Hargreaves filled it with a little bit of joy. I never met Cathy Hargreaves. I spoke to she's an actress called Lindy Brill. I don't know whatever came. I've talked about her so much.
That's why she hasn't been attached.
I'm surprised that her grandchildren haven't come and attacked me. So,
but it's interesting. This is very much about. I mean, this is an obvious thing to say, and it sounds a bit clunky saying it even. But it's about framing all. As you'll see, as you turn the pages of this catalogue school book, you encounter both the drawings on occasion and then the paintings, George's paintings, pretty roughly in a roughly chronological sequence, running from this painting and one that preceded it right through to 2001 when the show took place.
I mean, it came about because I gave the designer the actual exercise book I had as a child, and I glued in, because I didn't know how to talk to a designer. I just thought the best thing to do would be to print off all the stuff which I wanted in it, and I glued it in the book, and then handed him the book and said, reproduce that. So,
it's a fantastic catalogue, I tell you.
So I wrote all the index at the back in biro on top of my old physics equations and stuff like that. So it was a nice way to work, really nice. I don't see any models for it in how you might want to put together an exhibition catalogue. Has no title, has no essay.
That's a badge.
That's
No, that's good.
Making up for it with this one. But I quite like the idea that there was no essay. There was no authorial. I'm quite confident in the work. I'm going to have to go to somebody else and have that approved by a writer, or a historian, or kind of a jobbing name. So I just thought, but also I didn't want it to be seen entirely in the art world. That's the thing about an exhibition. It kind of happens. I mean, Anthony's gallery was in the East End. It was in a place where, on the whole, most of the people I associate with, on the whole, wouldn't have gone there. So I like the idea that this thing was an instead of, like a record. You could buy a record for 99p when I was growing up. It seemed fantastic, and you had this little bit of artwork in your hand, and it was just moved about. You could look at it on the bus. You could look at it in your own bedroom, and that's what I wanted this thing almost to be, really.
And then you've got this, so there's a whole sequence of the paintings, as you say, stuck down as if upon the page, and then some of the drawings, including one of the drawings that was in the Land of Nod show, juxtaposed with these collages, which takes us back to that world of collage.
Yeah, I've always done that in the studio, is to kind of just stick loads of stuff up, which is kind of pertinent to your way of thinking at that particular time, so...
And then, of course, one thing we haven't talked about, I mean, it's not really related directly to exhibitions, but I think everyone either knows about it or needs to know about it, is the fact that you do all the painting with this Humbrol enamel paint. And this is, again, a double-page spread from that same catalogue, which highlights that in its own particular way.
Yeah, it kind of illustrates the material, the Humbrol enamel there on the right-hand panel. This is a double-page spread in the book.
Yeah.
This is a still taken from a news report asking for witnesses to the murder of James Bulger. Everyone know James Bulger? Toddler who was missing and then found murdered in Merseyside. If anybody could connect these two items, it would have linked them to the killer, which it was.
Because they brought the killers, the children.
They shoplifted the batteries and the paint, and in fact the paint was used as incriminating evidence because the paint was found on James's body, and the paint was also found on Thompson and Venable's clothes.
Yeah.
So, but it should be this. I was using the paint. The Bulger killing was in the early 90s. I started using the paint in the mid-90s. I wasn't entirely aware that was the connection, but once that became connected, it was the idea that something as innocuous and as harmless as paint could be used, as this paint, the kind of paint which is found not in art shops, not in Cornelison's or Fitzpatrick's or hand ground by servants in some place, but it could be bought in the post office or the hardware shop, and could be used in the most horrific of killings. Not only a killing which is horrific in terms of what happened, but in terms of its implications to society in the 90s, and continues to be, because of the rearrest of one of the lads involved in it. It elevates this paint into something beyond material, into something which has cultural and psychological resonances. I find that quite intriguing.
About the dark side of childhood, which is
well, it's the dark side of childhood, but it's also, for some people, it's the light side of childhood.
Yeah.
Because they've been painted a beautiful plane with it or something.
So here's some of the other pages, just to show you. Sorry. Oops. Again, a collage of the drawings that featured in Land of Nod. Right, time is running on, George. So
it always runs on. That's the subject.
We wanted to talk a bit about the actual installation of your work, and we've got two slides here. One from an exhibition called Ash Wednesday that took place at Anthony's gallery, his former gallery in Cambridge Heath Road in 2005, and you can see an installation of you at a new gallery that he set up with his then partner, called the Wilkinson Gallery. And it's interesting about the shifts that you had to negotiate as an artist, thinking about these very different kinds of spaces, because the first gallery is on a smaller, more domestic scale. This was a purpose-built, much larger scale space.
Well, the image on the left of that, I don't think I ever thought about where the paintings went. I don't think up until this point I'd ever thought about where paintings went. I think I thought the two things I thought about were making the painting, which is an important thing for me, because the imagery was important, or what I wanted to say in the painting was important. What was also important was the money you got from selling the painting. That was quite important.
Yeah.
It seems glib to say that, but I always think that every painting I sell, or every painting that Anthony sells, buys me my life back. I don't have to work in a shit job. I just have to work in the job I do, which is a bit shit sometimes, but not as shit as some jobs you have to do. So it kind of buys the life back. So every painting that moves on. So I never really thought about it in that way. No. Although this was a very constructed, the image on the... This, I can't work out the... This
left-hand side, yeah.
It was a very orchestrated exhibition. All the paintings were called Ash Wednesday. It was installed in some way. The painting... From the Woodsman exhibition, I did think about the space. The space was, Anthony had had this new gallery built, and it was quite contemporary. It was quite begging to be thought about in terms of how you might design things. I felt more like Kevin MacLeod than I felt like an artist. And I thought, what could go there? So I started to, it was, the smaller space, you couldn't have a painting that was 2 metres wide. But this space kind of wanted a painting that was 2 metres wide.
Yeah.
So I did a number of paintings that were quite large. I did a number of paintings which were kind of what I call normal size. This exhibition, Woodsman, was a way of rather quickly me kind of dealing with my dad who died a few years earlier. So a lot of the images were images of things I'd painted before. So like, for example, this painting here was a pub, and now it's just a wasteland because the pub got knocked down. This is a painting of the goalpost, which was on my first exhibition I did with Anthony. Now someone's just given it a good kicking. And there were some other images which were all the previous motifs. I like that expression in art history, motifs. I prefer motives in terms of serial killing. But I kind of returned to the scene of the crime, to use that analogy a little bit more, and found out that someone had kicked the shit out of it, essentially. That's what had happened to my motifs. His hand didn't have that problem. He didn't go back to the mountain and find out someone had kicked the shit out of it, did he?
No.
Well, I had that.
And the downstairs, it's also interesting that you were thinking about these two, because this gallery had two very different, two spaces that had a very large, both large spaces.
It was like a bunker. Downstairs was like a bunker.
Yeah.
And then upstairs was like a cathedral, which I quite enjoyed. So
this is all downstairs. This is what you saw when you walked in downstairs. Interesting. There's a whole convention of installation photography, by the way. Of course, you forget that often these spaces are filled with people, or typically should be. But then upstairs was this. And for that upstairs space and for this exhibition, you did something very different. These very large-scale charcoal drawings of the woods that surrounded.
I mean, it's very much designed. I thought, where else could these have gone?
Yeah.
And these were 6 drawings which I did, which were directly related to my dad dying. We used to go for a walk in this wood, and then shortly after my dad had died, I suddenly found out that, or they're probably always there, but because he died, I saw them a bit more. But all the trees that we'd all looked at had fallen over, been knocked over, or been chopped down. So, and the upstairs space of Anthony's gallery there offered that quiet, contemplative cathedral. And I had actually envisaged, I had kind of envisaged something like an altarpiece thing in it, and then maybe one wall was slightly shorter than the other, so 2, 3, and then 1. But then we came to install it. It was quite nice to have you don't really get the things in the room. It was quite nice to have a blank thing at the end. And I often think about that. At the moment, I've got a couple of exhibitions that we're working for, and people are sending me kind of CGI things, and I went, I don't know what that means. Can we just leave it open, so on the couple of days beforehand we can move stuff around? That when you walk into that space, things might change. You might realise that the light's coming in at a different angle, which you don't tend to see on their computer models, where the light comes in or whatever. So that leaves some kind of intuitive thing. You don't have this problem with dead artists, of course. If you do an exhibition with Joshua Reynolds, he's not interfering, is he?
He isn't, no. Which there is a downside to that as well as a good side. Yeah. No, that's true. So this was The Woodsman, and look, we could have spent the next 4 hours talking about the exhibitions that George has done. There are many others that he's done with Anthony elsewhere that are equally interesting and rich to talk about. But we thought we'd spend the last bit of time that we've got talking about the show that we've been doing together. And just to say that it's another interesting thing for you, because, I mean, the one exhibition that we could have talked about, or maybe should have talked about, was this amazing show at the National Gallery that George did just a couple of years ago when he was, after 2 years as a resident artist at the National Gallery, My Back to Nature. So you've worked in an institution in a space that's very much devoted to historic art already. And that's a very different kind of space as other exhibitions you've done. Like
you have to really speak to my therapist about my experience at the National Gallery. If you want to talk about working with the dead men.
I know. But that thing about working with a public, with an institution like the National Gallery, or you've worked with an icon gallery, or the Baltic, compared to working with your gallerist, is a very different kind of show or an exhibition that typically gets up. I remember we've talked about the fact that these shows that you've been doing with Anthony, essentially you're curating him yourself.
Well, I mean, I think that's something which I've never really seen acknowledged that much, to be honest, is exhibitions which happen within essentially commercial or private gallery dealer spaces are on the whole curated by the artists themselves, with a small negotiation with the people who run the space. There tends not to be a curator getting in the way.
No.
Or with their own, one more. It's like and a curator's like an architect. Someone who just gets in the way of your idea. And so when you're looking at the exhibitions I've done with Anthony, he's on the whole, with the odd exception, just kind of said to me, "You do what you want to do, and then we'll do it." With things like the exhibition at the Icon or the Baltic, you're assigned a curator, or a curator's commissioned the exhibition and what have you, and they have very clear ideas about what your work means to them and and that's a very different experience. Yeah. So, but I think what actually happens within commercial galleries is you're actually seeing a much more clear relationship between the art you see as an exhibited artwork and what actually goes on in the studio. I think that happens less now with galleries like Gagosian, because they have curators and they have people like that. But the galleries I'm really interested in seeing, which tend to be kind of based in South London or in East London or not in London at all, they tend to have a much more intuitive relationship. The people who run the galleries have a much more intuitive relationship with the artist, and there's a much more, I suppose, it's a slightly romantic view, but it feels to me that what you're looking at is the artist's work instead of a curated version of that.
Yes. Well, it's certainly going to be a combination of the two at Yale.
Well, you're quite good. Yeah, you're quite good. Yeah. But it's been a long time. I've been teaching you a long time now.
I know. It's been 3 years.
Well, no, I mean, one of the things that working with
two-way dialogue. No, one-way dialogue. But talking of dialogue, because it's been really interesting. This has been as you've seen over the last few weeks, I've tended to work on historic shows before. This is the first show I've done with a contemporary artist, and I have learnt enormously from talking to George. It's been great. The joke that I make it's not a very funny one, but it's that I could never ring up Hogarth or Reynolds to ask them what on earth was going on in this image that we're going to be showing.
You could try.
I tried. It didn't work very well. I'd had to do it kind of metaphorically. Whereas with you, I can do it. And we've spent ages talking about the show, talking about the ways in which we can organise this retrospective survey of George's work, how we can organise something that will work over 12 different bays of a display.
But oddly enough, so can we just go back to that image? Sorry, if I'm like Ken Dodd. I know he's dead, but you check your last tube train time. This image, we thought it would be interesting to put together these two images because it would show a contrast between what normally happens at Yale and what happened at an exhibition I did at Wilkinson Gallery in 2009. And when we put the two together, we thought, there's more similarities than there are differences. There was one.
It's partly because of the building.
The building is, it has that kind of modern. But also, there's, paintings on a wall. What are you going to do? I've seen people, they try to do something, painting in the expanded field and all this, but on the whole, they sit quite comfortably on a painting only needs a wall and 2 nails. It just sits there quite quietly and does its job.
So
and light.
Yes, and it gets great light at Yale.
Yeah.
Yale's amazing for light.
My paintings hate natural light as well.
This is interesting. This is it's for us or me in terms of this archive. So I put a proposal together for the show. Basically, what happened was Amy Myers, the director of the Yale Centre for British Art, was very keen on doing a show of George's painting. Had been an admirer for a long time, and also talked to me about my interest in doing something on a contemporary artist, and basically brought the two things together and decided that and kind of organised a dinner, or helped organise a dinner where we had the chance to meet each other, and I think she was just checking that we got on okay and that we had a good conversation if we did. And so then basically Amy kicked it off. Initially, as you might be able to tell if you can look, you can see the details here, it was initially intended actually to have taken place last autumn, which would have killed both of us. But we got a year's extension. You can see it's been scratched out, and I found out at that meeting, I think this must have been something I took to a meeting, that it was going to take place in 2018. The other interesting thing is that we weren't sure of a title, then George came up with this title. That's his writing. He said, let's call it, he said, this is what, I think we were sitting next to each other, and he said, this is what we're going to call the show, A Corner of a Foreign Field, which gestures to Brooke, but also to
L.P. Hartley, yeah. J.P. Hartley is the Yellow Pages.
Sorry, L.P. Hartley.
No, which is just as nice as well. But so yeah, I mean, he's going to have an exhibition in America of a British council estate, essentially, or a British. I thought it was perfect.
And I did too. So we agreed on that, and then basically we've been working on thinking about both a show and a catalogue. This is a couple of pages from George's sketchbook. When we were at Yale, we went to
this isn't a funny phase.
It looks like a funny phase. But in fact, that's
exhibition design.
That's George's exhibition design. Maybe he does need a curator. But that's the layout of the bays on the third floor, or what's called the third floor at the Yale Centre. And you can see that George, we'd already started talking about the layout. Those are partitions that he's drawn there, and you can see early. And I'm not even sure what you'd written there. Oh, Ash Wednesday might go to the second bay. And you can see on the right-hand side, we're already talking about potential catalogue authors and writers that we might approach to be involved in this project. So George is jotting some things down.
But I quite like, can we go back to that? Yeah. One of the things that's quite interesting, one of the stumbling blocks in some senses, talking about my work, is chronology and talking about chronology. because my paintings kind of move about with time, which is part and parcel of it. One of the things that Mark wants to do as a curator is to kind of have a consistent...
Clear, concise, precise.
And the work
chronology.
defies that, because I'll go backwards and forwards and move around with that. One of the things I've just noticed about this, you get out of the lift here, Fiddles into Yale, and then you go in here, and then you go around chronologically anti-clockwise.
So we'll just turn the whole show around. We'll start with later.
No, but
we'll go,
I remember
yeah.
thinking that is conventionally, because you read,
Yeah.
we're Westerners, we read that way. Somebody else might read that way, but we always instinctively go that way. But you're going back in time.
I wonder why we didn't do it the other way around. I can't think, actually.
But I thought that was interesting anyway. But that happens quite a lot in exhibitions. You go chronologically the wrong way around.
You do. Normally you do. If you think about the Tate shows, I'm just thinking about the shows I've been involved in before, and that's true.
So you end up with the worst work, which is always the latest work.
So...
Oh, it's like going to a Rolling Stones concert. Don't play your new music. We want to hear Satisfaction.
Yeah, IDST. Let's hear it again. So this is, and then this, well, and this will take you on a quick walk, because we are running over time. But,
Sorry, it's my fault.
No, it's okay. We thought we'd introduce, you can see on that diagram, this is a much tidier version of that same plan, and we'd begin with this amazing triptych of works that George produced for the National Gallery show, including this work, the Rood Screen. And I just thought I'd show you a few of the works that we have organised it chronologically, increasingly so actually, as the more I've written about it, and about George's work, the more it makes sense to me chronologically. So it's, we're very different in that perspective. And also, but we'll try to think about ways in which we can, as we've been hearing about the last few weeks, varying the pace of the show. So we move often from rooms of paintings to rooms of drawings. So we're really making a big fuss about George's drawings as well as the paintings, because we think that people will be absolutely fascinated by them. And then also trying to find a distinct theme or issue or preoccupation that seems to have defined George's work at particular times in his career and in particular exhibitions. And what I've realised we've got 12 bays here in the exhibition, as you can see. There's the introductory bay, and then we have 10 others. And in each of those, in writing the text that accompany each section of the catalogue, I found that in many ways we can tie the theme that I've identified as central for each of the bays to an exhibition. And so it's, in many ways, this tells a story which is a sequence of 10 exhibitions or so, as much as it is a sequence in terms of any other kinds of logic. And so, this is an amazing work from the National Gallery display. But we begin in Bay 3 on that diagram with that early work that saw expression at the Royal College and then at Anthony's first shows, including works like this, Scenes from the Passion, Christmas Eve. That's in Bay 3. I just wanted to we're jumping around now, we're just showing you again the very different character of George's work as he's moved through his career and his practice. This is Ash Wednesday, this amazing image of a sunlit and shadowy tree that George has returned to repeatedly, and that's got amazing resonances here. And this is one of those moments when you can really talk about the art historical depth and richness of George's work, which I think is there in every single painting, but here it's especially apparent when you compare it to a painting like Holman Hunt's The Shadow of Death, to which it offers a really amazing echo and response and sequel in some ways, which we explore in the catalogue. But then also to move to, again, a section which we're calling Graffiti and Abstraction, where George explores graffiti and inscription on the estate, but also is working in a way which really is in dialogue with a modern abstract painting and thinking about geometry and mathematics and composition in really fascinating ways in works like this. So I think that the idea is that we'll move from a picture and a sequence of the type that we get in Ash Wednesday, and suddenly to hit this, and a room of pictures like this will feel very different. And I guess that's one of the roles that I've played, and in discussion with George, we both try to cultivate this sense of an exhibition where there's a sequence of 10 or 12 mini exhibitions in which you have a distinct experience and we're duplicating that in the catalogue too. including then this amazing work that we've gathered together under this title, The End of Time, the gallery we're calling that section, which really deals with the breakdown and the demolition of so many of those iconic sites that George had painted earlier in his career, and that represented this shifting history of Tile Hill, where it does get into, you say it gets worse as it gets. I don't think so. What really is fascinating is that long-term autobiographical project of an imagery which is engaging with George's childhood and his childhood and memories of childhood, and filtered through that memory, is now in dialogue with a chronicling of the changes that he's seeing as a contemporary adult, as it were, in the fabric of Tile Hill and the political underpinnings of that change. And that fusion of those two projects, of the autobiographical project and almost the sociological or topographical project, into one practice, is really making works that I think are pretty astonishing, actually, and amazingly impressive. And then we've been talking continually, and just again about the working. We've talked about how one puts the catalogue together. So here's a couple of pages from a notebook of mine, and this is, we said to each other, right, we've chosen 80 or so works for the show, or more. We'll spend an hour talking about every one of them together, and then I'll write up, as it were, I'll write a commentary on them. So on the left-hand side, you see my notes to a conversation that I had with George on a visit to his studio last year before, where we talked about this painting on the right. And the more we talked, the more amazing it became, and we started recognising, or I started learning about the references it makes to the writings and the last interview that Dennis Potter gave just before he died, when he knew he was dying, and when he talked about that astonishing thing that notion of imminent, or knowledge of imminent death brings, where you really end up living in the present and appreciating things that might just be standing outside your window. And he talks about the pleasures of seeing the blossomiest blossom of a tree that he would in the past maybe have glanced at, but now fully appreciated outside his window, he talks about. And then this is the tree that stood directly opposite George's bedroom window that you saw in painting earlier on. So it's an amazing fusion of the very personal on George's part with something that engages with a hero of yours in some ways, Dennis Potter, someone who'd been, again, another crucial component in your
Again, it's that very personal. I mean, it's all well and good having personal or very sensitive things, but we all feel them. You know, going to go down the road or talk to anybody in the road. It's making them concrete for other people to access in a way, and that's what happens with exhibitions. That's the difference between an exhibition and an artwork. An artwork can happen anywhere, in anyone's life, in a prison cell or in a studio or whatever. What happens in an exhibition, an exhibitionist, is then things become public. And I'm quite interested in that. One of the things that happened with Dennis Potter was those very, very personal, subjective and nostalgic feelings he had, which he ended up putting on TV to 18, 19, 20 million viewers. I mean, there isn't an art show in the world that would get that now. Even online, it's not going to get that. So I think that's standing up to that robust, that very sensitive little chord, that little sound that you send out into the noise. The fact that it still holds its beauty is what makes the success of an exhibition, I think.
Yeah. And again, this is our prospective low list. We didn't get all of these paintings, almost all of them all. And this is we put together a low list, as you've seen us doing other projects that we've been talking about the last few weeks. And again, these are my notes taken from a conversation with George over the phone, where we spent ages talking about these pictures. I was looking at really beautiful versions of them on screen and taking notes on these pages. So again, that will feed into the next bit of writing I've still got to do. We've got our editor here, George, who's incredibly tough and demanding in terms of deadlines, quite rightly, and we're falling a bit behind.
Are they sober? Where are they?
I am slowly falling behind. So this is the next thing I've got to write. So over the next week or so, I'm going to be writing about these paintings as we put the finishing touches, I promise, to the catalogue for the show in October. And talking about finishing touches, this is a painting that George has just finished, one on the right, and he took this photograph this morning before he came to London. So maybe that's a nice way to finish. Do you want to talk about it?
Well, the painting on the
On their left,
this
everyone's
this
left.
one. The painting I made, obviously. One of the first paintings I made, where I thought that I was making a painting which meant something, as opposed to pretending to be Francis Bacon. It's quite. I can remember a tutor at the Royal College saying, "Oh, you're part of the school of bad painting." I thought, "You cheeky fucker! I'm trying quite hard here." Does anyone remember the school of bad painting? No, I didn't think you would. What was it called after
Stuckists.
YBA? No, not the Stuckists. There was the YBA and there was the new sensationalist.
New neurotic realism.
The new neurotic realism. That's what it was. I went, no, I'm part of the old neurotic realism. So it was very much. You can actually put it in the slot. If you looked at paintings made in '96, around about that time. But the painting on the right, this is Humbrol enamel on an MDF panel. The painting on the right is exactly the same size. They're both paintings of, well, this is a painting of my mum and dad's house, or our house as we called it. Sounds like a madness single, which I don't think is too bad. The painting I finished this morning, it's just called Mum's, because Mum is the only person who lives there. But everyone seems to go there all the time. So it went from being a family home to being Mum's house. So, because I'm curious, the odd thing about it is for me in terms of Mark's chronology, I am, according to Nabokov, chronophobiac. I'll explain that if you could be bothered to have a drink with me at some point. This is a painting made in 1996, but it's how I remembered it in 1980. The painting on the right is exactly how it looks now. Well, it's exactly how it looked then, because it's a painting. So, some things have changed. Spring's come. It's not. Good paintings take a long time. And it's on canvas, which is slightly different. And of course, the council have got a disability railing for everyone. They've clad the building in cladding, which is a politically interesting topic. And the houses on either side have now been bought. So these are all council houses, and now the only council house is my mum's. The house. You can always tell a council house because it has this down. You can always tell a house that's been bought because this has got hard standing, which you can't see. And you can always tell a house that's been bought because it still has the outside that looks like the 1980s because they haven't updated it. But the first thing that you notice, most of all, when anyone's written down any close habitation to people, is wheelie bins. That's the thing which seems to be everywhere. It's like, if a wheelie bin can get there, a Dalek can get there, so we're doomed. So, in the course of painting this, because I painted from photographs, which is another topic, which we can come back to as well, Virgin Media have dug up this to put in a cable which makes viewing almost like you can't see it, but they've made a massive pile of tarmac outside. I always think about that, about reusable energy. No one thinks, plug in the car, no one thinks about the great turbine that's producing the air. So it's a very strange, but it still stands. Number 57, that's how we always know it. My mum was supposed to move out of there last year, but then she refused to move. Yeah, good. Yeah. One of the first decisions that she'd made for years. Jared, who's making a film about my mum move, had to rethink about what his film was going to be about. So one of the things is it's actually become quite a sumptuous painting. I've kind of worked out a way of painting which looks like an oil painting, as opposed to this which looks like an enamel painting. So there's all sorts of things to do with technique and things which which we can talk about. And of course, this has got no light in it at all. And this is very much the light of, I was hoping it would look like the light of morning. Oh, thank you. Yeah, so the sun's just come over the top of the houses behind, so you just see slightly the shadow of the houses at the back of us. So, and it's kind of early autumn, so paintings and photographs tend to do that. They kind of really confuse the chronology. So.
And in the show, the plan, of course, is that we'll, having seen that great triptych that will dominate your view as you come out of the lifts and go into the introductory bays, that you'll see on your right, as you'll begin your anti-chronological or anti-clockwise journey, the first image, but then facing you, if you look to your left, you'll see the last. And the idea is that these two images will bring you full circle.
But I really enjoy the idea that you go anti-clockwise, because you end up, but you go anti-clockwise to end up with the newest thing. There's a really nice poetic
inverse symmetry.
Yeah, I quite like well, it just has a nice ring to it. It's almost like antimatter. You know, the whole notion of antimatter, or it feels quite Stephen Hawking about it. That it confuses people enough to make it sound attractive. A little bit like the greatest poetry. Yeah. If anyone understands poetry, then it's shit.
Okay, on that note, I think we should finish. Okay, thank you, George.
Thank you, sorry, I
will. Thank you, Mark and George. We have gone over. I think we'll have time for one question. So just one question from the audience. Sure.
I hope it's a good one.
No, it's not.
All right, good.
Okay, all right. Any other questions?
Oh, go on, ask your crap question. No.
I'm interested in the fact that all of your paintings have such a linear focal point, almost as if in all of them through the woods and everything, you are going to a point in the future, almost back to your parents' front door, your home front door. And I wonder if you could comment about that sort of, the use of the perspective on it, the focal point.
Well, because I'm quite a bad poet. You could quote Robert Frost, and paths and blah 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 blah. So my compositions tend to be quite obvious in that regard. They tend to have a kind of leading thing, and they tend to have a flat thing. That's. Oh right, well that's good. Well, because I mean, all that happens in the studio is I kind of move. Well, I've got various sources. I've got little drawings. I've got, on the whole, lots and lots. So for a painting like this one, there is probably, 15 photographs that are ever so slightly different. Probably more from that one. I was really self-conscious about making it. But most of them have one or two photographs. And then they sit around for a long time before they get made. They kind of sit next to each other, to the point when quite a lot of the photographs I use as sources for the paintings will be quite dusty. And they kind of curl up at the bottom and they collect dust in this little trough. And I quite like the physical nature of a photograph rather than an image on the screen sort of thing.
But that's an interesting point. Can you elaborate on it? For you, what? That there's a sense of always looking into the future because of this. Go on.
Part of my thinking around this is very much looking at the Sheffield environment and your father losing his employment, and that whole sort of the disintegration of that area with the steelworks closing and mines closing, that whole period. I'm thinking this is about, to me when I look at them, this is about someone who wants to move forward in it, but also, and it's really interesting to me that these two paintings are about moving forward but also moving back. They're moving home, they're moving to something that's very solid and secure in a world that at that time was really beginning to unravel in that environment. And that's particularly when I think about the end of time, where you've got the sort of collapse of those industrial environments. This is something that has sustained over a very dramatic period in that environment. So, and quite an emotional period for to grow up in and watch those things become unravelled. I mean, even things as iconic as he was, as somebody like Jimmy Savile, who was in a childhood period of time lauded, but suddenly you find this is not what we thought we were looking at, and that's what I find interesting as well.
Well, one of the things that that art, I think, enables, or painting enables me to perform in the studio is a kind of acts of magic or alchemy and stuff. So you can look at things to do with instability or childhood or sentimentality, things which are kind of vaporous, things which are kind of disordered, and you can make a kind of order out of them. You can they're I don't want to say. Yeah, well, but I mean, they're not.
Yeah.
They're not, because obviously the point of catharsis and therapy is to kind of make you better, or to make you kind of whole. In some sense, what happens in the studio is you make it worse. It's a bit like rubbing an itch, but it's it feels so good. You might make a mess, but do you know what? It actually is a very, very beautiful mess. But the thing is, you're in control of it. So if you're scratching it, you actually, what you need to work out, like people with drinking disorders or whatever, you can make choices about those sort of things. I think there is a relationship between what happens in the studio and what happens in therapy rooms, or what happens in clinics or pubs or whatever, or churches or whatever. It's a way of dealing and processing things which have been inflicted on us, or we've inflicted on other people, or what have you. And for me, the composition, essentially we're dealing with a two-dimensional. It is. Oh, it wobbled. I thought it would be hard. So the vicar to the actress. Essentially, they're screens and surfaces. There's no depth to them at all. So what happens with the composition is you can create ways into this impenetrable surface and ways out, depending on how you want to look at it. Samuel Beckett writes about these things. I was talking to you about this great text from the from the Unnameable, where he writes about being unable to tell whether the journey that he's on is taking him back or out, which I really enjoy. And there was a series of paintings I made with Anthony a few years ago called The Painter on the Road, which are all about these country roads, which very much come from a Beckett-like composition of the country road with a tree from Way to Forgotten. And I was working from photographs I'd taken over a number of years of a road called the Coventry Road, which leads from Coventry to the A45, which eventually takes you to the motorway, which takes you away from home. And I was unsure, when I was making the paintings, which way I was looking. I couldn't tell whether I was painting back home or out. And I was like, oh, fuck. I think I'm actually, sensibly, there's a real big cliche of the working class kid playing his guitar or kicking the football out of their estate, and then having an ill-made house in Cheshire with a guitar-shaped swimming pool or whatever. I've done the opposite. I kind of painted my way back in. And the corner that we're talking about in the exhibition, there's the old drawing of a person painting a floor. And they kind of do this, and they go, oh, I'm nearly finished. And then finally, how do I get out without making footmarks out? And I've quite like the painted corner is a lovely, or the unpainted corner is a very nice little thing. So, but the other thing is that's to do with the composition about depth. The other thing is, which happened in the painting, is the composition of which aligns itself with the picture plane. That sounds like a bit of art college, doesn't it? Which comes from modernist architecture, which is a grid, which aligns itself up with the picture plane quite happily. So there's two things that happen. There's one that kind of penetrates the picture plane, or comes out of the picture plane. There's something which acknowledges the picture plane as a surface, but the other thing is the paint itself, which does both, because it's extremely shiny. So what happens is, if you see the pictures in the flesh, which you don't really see in reproduction or in catalogues, at the same time as being extremely flat, like a Gary Hume or an Ian Davenport, people who use household paints as opposed to art college paints or art historical paints, there's a flatness to them, but I use them like a Holman Hunt, which you shouldn't do, but they do reflect the interior. So you end up with this picture plane that Francis Bacon enjoyed so much, which is creating this kind of modernist abstraction of a human form, sticking some very cheap glass in front of it, never like museum non-reflective glass. So you saw the gallery, so you saw all the people reflected in the glass, and it became an irritation, which I kind of quite like. So there's a number of things all going on between the composition, between picture plane, between materials. And if I painted this as a black surface, using the paints I use, all you would see is all you lot looking back at it, like an unturned on telly.
Right, well, thank you very much. Join me in thanking George and Mark for this wonderful lecture.